So switches on the IEMs to alter the sound on the fly seem to be the next hot thing in the IEM world. So of course, after the KZ Castor, which was my first IEM with these switches, I had to look at another one. So welcome to my review of the CCA Polaris. Just like the Castor, the Polaris is also a pretty cheap IEM. I think it's around 15, maybe 20 euro, kind of the same price here. I don't know if this is a like sister company or sub label, whatever, of KZ. So it looks pretty similar. Let's just go into the review and start with build quality. Design wise, the Polaris strongly resembles the KZ Castor, but feels lighter and a little bit smaller. Otherwise, it's a strikingly similar design with the same switches. Yeah, they look really the same here. You get a little less metal and more see-through shell. Like on the Castor, you have a lot more metal here, but on the Polaris, you can see more of the inner workings here, and I guess that's why it's a little bit lighter. I said this in my Castor review, but I really like how they made the switches not protruding out of the shell here. Makes them less susceptible to breaking. And just like with the Castor, you should use this little thing here to switch the switches, because it's really difficult to do it with fingernails, and I would advise not to do it. They even use the same font for the Polaris logo name on the backplate, but there's a different vent design, like always with the CCA and KZ new offerings. You have like fancy vent thingies here. Cable is also the same, barely average KZ cable you always get. Talking about comfort, well, it's fine. Just like the Castor, the Polaris is not too bulky and the nozzle is not too wide, but they also do not disappear in your ears. I do not have any issues here, but these are certainly not small IEMs. They have a nice and secure fit though. The ear tips you get with these are these somewhat cloth-like KZ ear tips, and while they do feel fine, these are the only kind of ear tips that get a little itchy after a while for me, and I feel like my ears get a bit irritated. I'm not sensitive there, and it's just a very minuscule thing. But if you know you are more sensitive in the ear region, you may want to use other ear tips. So sound wise and with the switches in stock position, it's a nicely balanced and natural sounding tuning that orients itself on the Harman target, but without the weird dip in the lower mid range and the over the top upper mid range lower treble. So let's start with the lower frequencies here. Bass is nicely present, but never overwhelming. There's a certain boost there, of course, but I would not describe the Polaris as a bass heavy IEM. Most Harman target variants have this boost in the lower bass and halfway to the mid bass, and then roll off pretty fast, leaving a weak rest of the bass and lower mid range sections that follow, which makes vocals and instruments possibly sounding thin and shrill. That's not the case here, especially male vocals have a nice body to them, the same way as instruments sound full while not being muddy. So you get a smooth mixture between punchy mid bass and lower bass presence. But again, with these switches in stock position, there's really not a lot of bass. It sounds natural, but could be that there's not enough bass there for you. The upper mid-range certainly has some energy in it, but just like the bass, it's not overwhelming. Guitars and vocals sound clear without being shouty, and CCA really did the Harman thing right here, because just like with the present lower mid-range, they also avoided the overly intense upper mid-range that really is a love or hate thing. For example, with the first edition of the Truth Ear Zeros. You still get ample clarity and nice female vocals, and it just sounds smoother and easier to listen to. Treble is fine too. It's pretty balanced, with the lower treble taking a little step back to avoid this metallic and harsh sound that you get with instruments when that area is boosted too much, but it's still not laid back or relaxed. There are some peaks in the following treble sections that I noticed though. It's nothing too bad, but sometimes some sibilance or the occasional piercing cymbal crash would show itself. But otherwise the treble is pretty nice, and you do get some air in this upper treble clarity out of the sound. Again, we're talking about what, like, I think it's like €15. It's just like with the Castor, the tuning is absolutely fantastic for the price and really well done. So let's just go through some of the different sounds you can achieve with switching the switches. The first 3 switches boost the bass frequencies mostly below 100 Hz, so basically sub bass and parts of the mid bass, which is pretty noticeable and makes the sound even more groovy without sacrificing clarity, I would say. The last switch and all switches together up the whole graph a few dB, which does introduce some harshness to the sound. Honestly, I really do not see the need for that. If you like bass, up the first 3 switches and otherwise leave it in stock position. It really sounds nice either way. For me personally, I have found that activating the first 2 switches is a really nice compromise between not having enough bass and wow, this is too much bass here. Regarding technicalities, I mean, I keep repeating myself here, but again, just like with the Castor, it's kind of bonkers what happens here for a little over $10. But I guess we got kind of used to this kind of sound quality. But just take, for example, the separation of instruments here. It's pretty good, and I guess it's way better than like 50 or even €100 off-the-shelf Bluetooth earbuds. And when you look at IEMs that are like €50, 60 or 70 like the 7Hz Sonos, which is even a lot better than this one, it's impressive what kind of sound quality you get for your money here. So separation of instruments again is pretty good. Imaging is also fine. Most budget IEMs are kind of similar here. Since these really are dirt cheap, it's definitely worth to mention that these are pretty good here too. Since I mentioned the Castor quite often in this review, I thought about why not make a comparison with it. So here it is. There are 2 versions of the Castor out there, and I reviewed the more bass heavy version of the 2. And in comparison to the standard silver version, the Polaris has similar bass but a thicker sound because the lower mid-range is more pronounced as it is on the Castor silver. Overall, it has a bit less upper mid-range and treble, which makes it sound smoother. This really is a preference thing. The Castor just has a cleaner sound because of this cut in the lower mid-range, and it sounds like it stays cleaner with more bass more easily than the Polaris, but the Polaris sounds a bit more natural. In comparison to the black, the bass enhanced version of the Castor, the Polaris has a lot less bass, and you can get a pretty bassy sound with all bass switches activated on the Polaris too, but not as much as on the Castor black. Regarding mid-range and treble, it's basically the same thing here as what I just told you about the silver Castor. The Polaris still has a more pronounced lower mid-range and just sounds a little smoother and warmer than the Castor. Here the Polaris has more upper treble though, like it's a little bit more air, and it's just like, it just sounds a bit less dampened. So that's it with this review. Hope you liked it, and yeah, see you next time then. Hey guys, I'm just in the process of editing the video, and a little confusing thing just came up that I thought I'm gonna put at the end of the video. Regarding the switches, on CCA's website, they are telling you that each switch basically does 1 dB boost to the bass. So you get a manual with the Polaris, and like it's written here, you turn on switch 1, you get 1 dB, you turn on switch 1 and 2, you get 2 dB, and 1, 2, and 3, you get a 3 dB boost to the bass. If you take a closer look here, you can see that the pictures do not match with what's written there. Like the first picture is correct, you know, switch 1 upped, and the second one tells you that it's switch 1 and 2, but only the second switch is up. So the pictures don't really match with what's written there, and so you could yourself ask the question, well, maybe switch 2 alone ups the bass 2 dB, or maybe it's just a mistake in the manual here, because on the other side, on the other page, there is the manual, but with Chinese letters, and there the pictures are correct. So who knows, maybe it's just kind of a quality control issue here with the menu. But then there's another thing. I've looked at some graphs of the Polaris and the several switch positions to just confirm what I'm hearing. And actually, they did measure, or I mean, this is not CCA itself, but rather private persons, audio reviewers who do their own measurements. So of course there is like could be a mistake there too, but it's kind of mysterious. So they are measuring that switch 2 alone does more than 1 dB, and switch 3 alone basically does the 3 dB boost, but alone for itself. So that would mean that if all the switches are up, you would get a 6 dB boost, because, you know, switch 1 1 dB, switch 2 2 dB, and third switch 3 dB. This does not match with what CCA is writing on their own website. So that's really confusing here, together with the kinda confusing manual here. So I was listening to it myself. So I was upping the third switch and listening to how much bass is there, and then upping the first switch. And if it's like CCA is saying, if it's just 1 dB per switch, then should be the same. I don't have the perfect hearing, so maybe I'm wrong here, but I'm under the impression that the third switch alone does a stronger boost to the bass than the first switch alone. It's just a little punchier, just a little bit fuller. So this is really, really confusing here. And honestly, I don't know who to believe. If maybe it's a completely different thing, and I understand it wrong when I was looking at CCA's website, and they have this picture with the graph and then the several different position of the switches, and it basically says there that first switch 1 dB, first and second 2 dB, and then 3 dB, and maybe the measurements of the other persons are wrong. No idea. I just wanted to put that out there in case you were looking it up too, because I got confused a little bit. And yeah, either way, you get a nice boost to the bass with these switches, so they are not doing something wrong, and it's not like this should do 1 dB and then it's doing 10 dB. Like, it's not a huge difference, but it's noticeable if it's the case. So yeah, just wanted to put that out there, and if you're looking, this is like half the review what I'm talking here, so see you soon then.